plants that are being built right now. Well, so the whole platform
good morning.
is changing with the speed of
I'd like to welcome you all today to this discussion called the Electric Decade. I'm Meghan O'Sullivan. I am a professor at Harvard University, and I'm thrilled to be here with a very distinguished and interesting panel to talk about something of great importance. As is reflected in the WEF agenda, the ambition to get to net zero, to decarbonize the global economy, is something that is very much on the minds of everyone. And certainly, we are focused on the big goal of bringing carbon emissions to net zero. But behind that large goal, there are many, many, many other goals. The IEA actually put out a Net Zero 2050 report about a year and a half ago, and it cataloged 400 different steps that need to be taken. We're going to focus on a gargantuan task in itself, and that is electrifying the global economy. And not only electrifying it, but ensuring that that electricity is generated by clean sources of energy. This is an enormous challenge. We're talking about electrifying about half of the world's energy usage by 2050. And let me put that in perspective for you. We'll need to electrify all transportation, a lot of industry, buildings, and other things. This will require an enormous build-out of renewable energy and electricity infrastructure. In some very promising technologies like hydrogen, we think and talk a lot about hydrogen, but we have to keep in mind that we have to have enough renewable energy to generate green hydrogen to decarbonize a lot of those hard to decarbonize industries that can't be done with clean electricity. So we're talking about increasing the current amount of electricity generated in the world by 3 times by 2030. So just 7 years, and by 9 times by 2050. So this is a huge challenge. It's the focus of what we're going to talk about today. It's also the focus of an accelerator, 2 accelerators actually, that the World Economic Forum is launching to put a focus on this, on clean power, one on clean power, one on electrification. And today we're going to talk about the challenges behind this task and talk about some of the solutions that people have already identified and discover, how we can scale those up. We have a fantastic group here with us today to discuss this. First, on my immediate left is Henrik Andersen, who's the CEO of Vestas. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then next to Andreas, we have Vivianne Heijnen, who is the Minister of Environment from the Netherlands. And then to her left, we have Andreas Gluski, who's the CEO of AES. And then finally, bringing up the rear, we have Jakob Strasholm, who is the CEO of Rio Tinto. So very pleased to welcome you all today. I want to begin just with a very quick question that you can answer with a number. When I describe the challenge before us, can you give me your level of confidence, 1 to 10, that we're on track to meet this challenge of electrifying the global economy and doing it with carbon-free energy sources? So again, I know it's hard just to say a number, but I'm an American.
Then I better talk it a bit up, then 8.
8, okay, that's great.
I think in the Netherlands we're doing quite well, so I would give ourselves an 8, but maybe worldwide it would be more challenging to give that grade.
Okay, fair enough. Good distinction.
To give a global number, probably 6.
Yeah, I stay with a 5.
Okay, we have descending order of optimism here. No, I think those strike me as to be realistic assessments in the sense that this is something that is doable, but it is by no means inevitable, and that is what we're here to discuss. So let's talk a little bit first before we get into solutions and problem solving. Why is this so difficult? So again, as I mentioned, we're talking about electrifying 50% of the global energy usage with clean power by 2050. Currently, we're at 20%. Some scenarios have that 50% number to be even higher. So why are we at 20%? What are some of the obstacles or some of the challenges? Obstacles would suggest that they're not insurmountable, but what are some of the challenges? And so I'll begin with the minister. Vivianne, can you tell us, what do you see as some of the challenges to reaching these goals?
Well, if you look at the Netherlands, we are very ambitious when it comes to electrification and zero-emission vehicles. We want to sell 2 million electric cars by 2030, and from 2030 onwards, only electric vehicles will be allowed to be sold in the Netherlands. So that's going to be a huge shift. What we do see is that we have to focus on a good charging infrastructure. And in the Netherlands, we're doing quite well. We have one charging, what's it called? Charging station. We have one for every 4 cars, so we're doing quite well. But we have some challenges when it comes to the entire power system. And do we have enough energy and electricity to provide all the cars? So we're thinking of smart solutions. You see a lot of innovation in the field. There's a lot going on when it comes to vehicle-to-grid technology, where cars are used as a battery to charge back to homes or to offices. And we really need that because the power system is being challenged quite a bit by all the ambitions that we have. And that is a big point of concern. And I think that as a government, we also have to see and help the market to find ways to deliver and make sure that we have our charging infrastructure into place if we want to continue our ambitions in being in only selling electric cars from 2030 onwards.
Great, thank you. So now I fear there'll be some complaints about the role of government, but I'm inviting it all. Henrik, could you talk about what do you see as some of the big obstacles to reaching these goals?
I'll help Vivianne a little bit, but let me start somewhere else. I think my answer on the 8 is probably not talking about necessarily the 1.5 degree increase in temperature, because I think there we have to remember every transformation we are doing as a global society is a cumulative journey, and we are behind. So that's a fact, and that's probably where that rating would have been slightly lower. Mm-hmm. But I think my optimism is that if we look at it, take this community meeting, take the World Economic Forum, take the public-private sectors, today we work on seeing is believing. We are evidencing the solutions are here. So we don't have to necessarily look around, we don't have necessarily to invent new things to get that moving. And then therefore the optimism on my behalf is that I can see everyone wants to try to do it. Sometimes when you then want to do a global transformation of this scope and magnitude, of course you will hit some bumps on the road, you'll be faced with some challenges. And I think we all feel the same. It's much bigger than us as individuals, as us as companies, as us as sectors. So the only way here is actually what we are doing right now is to mobilize and engaging in how we can jointly make it easier. And I'll give you a good example. I'm probably in that luxury privileged situation. We're the world's largest OEM in turbines. It's probably the world's most sustainable product because after 4 months of lifetime, it goes CO2 neutral, and then it displaces CO2 in the rest of its life. Of course, we work that it will happen from day one with green steel at one day. But the result of that is that we now displaces over 230 million tons of CO2 from the turbine fleet a year. Hang on. Then we in that company, we have 29,000 people. We said to them 3 years ago, if you want a benefit car, it's going to be an electric car, right? And everyone said, I don't know. There is a lack of charging stations. So here I have a choice. I can now go to the minister and saying, there's no charging stations. No. Companies, large companies like us, we then put charging stations. We invest in charging stations in all our facilities. So if you take a company car that is an electric car today, you can also charge it in our facility. By the way, when it's not full, any guest can come and charge, anyone from society can charge. And I think the infrastructure and the collaboration here makes this happen. That's why I'm an 8.
So I can feel the optimism because you're going to solutions before we're teasing out the problems. So do you want to highlight, is there any challenge that you are struggling with that you feel is systemic or you feel that needs a frontal assault?
Yeah, we have to admit that if we look at it, the transformation is running slower than we probably would have appreciated. Yep. So the acceleration of it, and this is where I helped Vivianne with the charging numbers. Then I also maybe ask Vivianne to help me a little bit with speeding up reducing the red tape and making the permitting happen a bit faster, because that's probably a little bit of a hindering bump on the road right now. But I think if we both admit not easy to get done, if two parties meet, not easy to get done, I think sitting down we can fix it.
Sure. No, I mean, permitting is something that you hear across the board. I hear it constantly in the US context, the European context, and others. So Andreas, could I bring you in? Just, is there something, what is at the top of your list in terms of challenge that need to be addressed to speed up this electrification with clean power?
Well, let sort of give a big picture. Before I was in electricity, I was in telecoms, and we really did have the digital revolution. And what was very interesting about it, what made it happen, more than government regulation, it was a killer app. It allowed you to do more things with your existing infrastructure, and then came cellular. And it allowed people, especially like developing countries, have so much, access to banking, to other things. So what do I think that we need in the electric sector? Today, the cost of renewables as energy is in most places cheaper. It's cheaper than fossil fuels, the cost of energy. So what's the problem? Capacity. That's the ability to have 24/7 electricity. So that's the part that we have to address. So there was a lot of talk about renewables, fossil fuels. Let's be clear, renewables are the cheapest energy in most applications. They don't provide capacity. So for example, we attacked this about 14 years ago. We said, what's the solution? Well, theoretically, it was using lithium-ion batteries. And at the time, they were very expensive. So when we started, it was kind of a joke, people, on panels like this. And well, today, lithium-ion batteries for grid stability, they're in like 40 countries. We actually had to create a JV with Siemens, because we're not an OEM, to sell it around the world. But that's part of the solution. And we need other things. How do you get that capacity? So maybe in the future, green hydro is the way to go. And maybe even small nuclear reactors to drop them in. But that's what I see the problem. That's when you asked me how optimistic it was. We have fantastic technology that at the price points of today is the most competitive. But you have to put in that capacity. And there's a lot of still things to be achieved there. So that's what you asked me, what's the biggest hurdle? Governments can set the stage. What the US just did with the Inflation Reduction Act is fantastic, and we can talk about why that's so important. But what I would say is that the technology has to become cheaper than the alternative and better than the alternative. And I think we're getting there. So I just think that 2030 is pretty close.
Yeah, it's a very interesting fact about this energy transition that unlike other historical energy transitions where we've just had new energy sources mounting on top of old energy sources, here we need to displace old energy sources, coal first, ideally. And so that makes it even more challenging and the price points even more relevant. Jakob, if I could come to you, and again, what I'm asking for about challenges is not because I'm a pessimist, but because we can only, take down the obstacles once we identify them.
No, absolutely. I think there's two reasons why I only was giving it a 5. I'm very optimistic on the challenge, but we just have to, first of all, recognize that we haven't got the market system to work. The world has not been able to implement a carbon pricing, and we don't have effective green premiums on products that are produced with a lower CO2 today. So the market mechanisms doesn't entirely work. Then you've got second best things, and I fully agree, IRA is going to make a huge difference in the US. But so that's the one thing. The second thing is, and I say that we are probably the world's, Western world's largest user of electricity. It's not that easy to get green energy at scale. So for example, right now we are trying to, we already have 75% of our electricity from mainly hydropower. But then we have some aluminium smelters in Australia where we're trying to decarbonize that. But really getting solar and wind at scale is not that easy. And it actually takes a lot of time. People say, Australia, perfect, lots of sun, lots of space. It's not that easy. You actually first have to acquire the land. You have to get working with the indigenous people. You have to go through cultural clearance of sites, etc. And we're used to big sites in mining. But quite frankly, mining sites are small compared to the scale of these parks. The world has not really done this at scale yet. And that's why I think sometimes we're fooling ourselves a little bit on the timeline. It's going to take time. And it actually raises another question whether people have to look at nuclear as well.
But on the other hand, if I may comment on the timeline, I have debates in Parliament about the timeline and the ambitions that I have to make sure that no other cars are being sold in the Netherlands, but electric ones from 2030 onwards. And then people also ask me, are you being realistic? And then I said, well, I'm ambitious and I want to raise the bar as high as I can, because I want us all to work to that point. If we lower the ambition, then we will try to jump over that bar. And I think it's very important to keep our ambition high, because this is the only way to go forward. And people have to know that this is the transition that we're going to make. And the problem also with the charging infrastructure, also if you look at trucks, I was at Volvo Trucks some time ago in Gothenburg when we had a state visit from the Netherlands. And Volvo is really committed to electrifying all trucks. But they are also a bit worried about the charging infrastructure for trucks in Europe in this case. So they decided, you know, you can wait for one or the other, but they just decided to start investing in charging infrastructure themselves. So I think that's a very good idea, because we need to have the charging infrastructure into place in order for companies to make the transition to electrification. So we really need to help each other, and by raising that bar and by really setting high ambitions, I think we will at least manage to pull it off earlier than when we just say, okay, let's try and aim for 2050.
But Jakob, I didn't hear you say don't be ambitious. No. What I heard you say is that we have to recognize that there are some really difficult choices that need to be made here. And it's echoing a lot of what we heard from Henrik about the permitting and about siting big projects, be it mines, be it infrastructure, be it big wind turbines. And my question is, and I'll come to you, Jakob, and then back to Henrik. So I've asked this question, who's doing this well? Who's able to permit these mines and infrastructures better? And you look and you find the Indians have actually made more progress. Well, why is that? Because, as one official told me, they've relieved a lot of renewable energy projects from having to do environmental assessments. So, here, is there a trade-off between biodiversity, environment, and getting this renewable energy infrastructure up? Or, is that something that we need people to talk about more explicitly? So, Jakob, I'll come to you.
Yeah,
and then
no, I don't think so. I mean, we cannot compromise on other things, like you got to bring along your local communities, indigenous population. It takes the time it takes.
Yeah.
You can't change. There's something about bureaucratic procedures or permitting you can break down, but the whole process of environmental impact assessment is a proven thing. It works well. Obviously, we should try to speed it up. Can I just say, I keep pushing very hard. I love EVs. I've been driving an EV the last 7 years. The point is just, you need three things for an EV. First of all, you need the EVs. Secondly, you need green electricity for the EV. Otherwise, you're not achieving a lot. And that part is going too slow. And the third thing, and Henrik actually made a really good fun fact. He said, a windmill earns its carbon manufacturing in 4 months. An EV typically takes 6 to 7 years, assuming that you're using green energy. So my point is just the following: you actually need to push on all three things. We come in very much in terms of how can we help with the materials that you use for producing an EV to have less CO2 in that. So for example, aluminium, many EVs, they're using much more aluminium. If you're not using it with green sources, it takes a long time to offset that.
Right.
So there's just, my point is, this is a huge challenge.
Yeah. Henrik.
No, and just know, I like the ambitions. I just think it's super important when we talk about ambitions. You sometimes you dip into the demand side, and then you have to also be ready to go up to the other one, which is the supply side. Because in any global transformation, if we get the demand and the supply wrong in this transformation, we get a lot of frustrated either communities or countries or even continents. And I think that's the important one. And I love sort of the fun facts as well. It takes 4 years in a country, small country like Denmark, to get to a portfolio of electric vehicles that now holds storage for transportation equal to somewhere around 1.4 million households of electricity usage. So fun fact is, every politician said, oh, come on, when the wind doesn't blow, then the whole thing stops, the electrification doesn't work. No, hang on, the technology works in tandem now, so we actually get a momentum in some of these things. So I like it, but it doesn't take away from that when you want to do more electric vehicles, you want to do more charging points, you also need to do more supply in the same vein. Otherwise, you get frustrated users. And I think that's super important. And otherwise, we also run the risk of creating this A and B league of nations. And coming back to all what says they have all solved it. I work in 80 plus countries. Let's have that private conversation afterward. There is a little bit of, well, we come to Davos and then everyone actually have a really, really efficient permitting process.
I wouldn't say that even the person I spoke to claimed that India had solved it. I think the numbers do show that India is permitting more quickly, but again, I take your point.
I exported most of my turbines out of India since 2016, so if they've solved it recently, I will say.
Since you landed,
very
landed in Switzerland. Actually, I want to take your point about A and B countries, or and get to this fact by turning to Andreas to ask about, moving the conversation to look at solutions. You work in so many different countries, and I presume that there have to be different approaches to electrifying economies in different societies, different countries. Can you talk a little bit about how that your approach needs to be differentiated depending on the market you're working in?
Well, I think in this whole discussion, sometimes people tend to think there's like one solution and there's like one silver bullet. There isn't. Right. And there are different bullets for different countries. So you have to approach it differently. Not only do they have different resources, they have different infrastructure. So, for example, again, use the example of telecom. It's really how can we leapfrog? So, for example, in places like in Africa where you don't have a well-built out grid, it makes more sense probably to go to much more distributed energy. You don't have it. But in places like Europe and the States where you do have a grid, and then you can apply smart solutions and intelligent, it's a very different solution. So it's not one size fits all. But I do think that what we have to do is think of what are the bottlenecks, and the different bottlenecks in different countries. So for example, transmission is a big bottleneck. So people talk about it takes you 10 years to get a permit, another 5 years to build it, a lot of local stakeholder issues. Well, how can you make better use of a transmission grid? So we've used a lot of fun facts. A lot of transmission lines are used at maybe 10, 20% of their capacity. Because you have to build 1,000 miles for what is the peak. And that peak could be 15 minutes, it could be 3 hours of a day. The rest of the time, it's underutilized. So it's kind of like, is there an opportunity for an Airbnb of transmission lines? Well, there actually is. So if you put a bunch of new renewables here, you can put a battery here which sucks up the renewables when they're produced. It will send it across the transmission line when it's available. You have another battery here, it sucks it up and gives it to the client when he needs it. So that's the sort of smart solutions that I think we have to do more. So, for example, we have a project for the North Sea of Germany where you have offshore wind, and then you have to transmit it across all of Germany to the big industrials in the southeast. And in Germany, Europe's very hard to get permits. And so you hear a lot of those complaints. Banks of batteries, can't totally solve the problem, but can save decades in terms of this. So that's what I think we need, like we did in telecom, more smart solutions. And it's not one size fits all. In the States, let's face it, we're facing some labor shortages and EPC issues building out the solar. And in the States, you have a lot of space. One of the things we're working on is robotics for building solar farms. So that will, people say, well, will that be less jobs? Yes, but it'll be more inclusive jobs. Because I invite anybody to work on a solar farm in Utah in 100 degrees, and you're lifting 60-pound solar panels all day. Not a lot of people can do that. But everybody can drive a little joystick. So it provides gender equality, a lot more equality of the jobs that you are offering. So I saw it in telecommunications, where we leapfrogged certain places. The first 100% digital telephone network in the world was in Chile. And it wasn't because they had the best, it was because they had a really bad one. So it made sense to go to the next technology. You've seen what cellular has done in Africa. So we have so many neat technologies now that I think it's a question of seeing what works in that country. What are the bottlenecks? Different bottlenecks in Europe than you have in the States, than the other places, and how can we approach it intelligently? And what we really need from government is that the regulators be up to date on the latest technologies to allow them to be implemented.
This is a key point.
Can I just tie a little extra dimension on yours, Andrew, because we know each other that well. Try to Google Lucas Graham. He's an artist, a well-known artist, quite a lot of hits on Spotify and other stuff. He came to us and said, I want to do a CO2 neutral concert. And we thought, okay, all right. We actually went to our good partner in Volvo. We used some of their trucking batteries. They can be both new and used, by the way. When the truck is out of life, there's 60 to 70% still in the batteries. So we built a storage solution in a container, and we said, Lucas Graham powered by Vestas. It's different when you test electric guitar on a battery solution, I can tell you that. Our engineers loved it. He did a full concert, including warm-up, including light show, all of that, completely CO2 neutral. Do you know what? Seeing is believing, right? There was 100,000 people that were in through 5 concerts who saw that. And it was all storage from renewable energy into recycled trucking batteries. So therefore, the dimension of how we can do is so much further out than just thinking the traditional big stuff or a turbine. It's how we use it.
So before I move to Jakob and Vivianne on this, I wanted to ask you about solutions when it comes to cross-sectoral solutions or public-private partnerships. What kind of role do you see those things in playing to advance this electrification challenge?
No, as I said here, we sit with esteemed and honorable minister. I think we need to get much more used to, and this is where we have to get back to a little bit this, are we afraid of the red tape or are we afraid of the bureaucracy, rather than having an open exchange of both ideas and how we can solve it. And often when I go into a ministerial visit, I will always be blamed for he's only there to sell turbines, and that's maybe okay, but people that know me is I extend a little bit further than just a product way. And I think from that, the collaboration comes from understanding also the hard fact. I don't envy Vivianne's job because she has to get re-elected every 4th year, right?
Yes.
And there is something in a transformation of this magnitude. Then some of the decision you are wisely taking now might upset people that makes you not get re-elected, but actually it's the right solution 20 and 30 years on from now. And I think this is for me the where we can give each other powder to the ministerial and the public side, and which just, I'm here this week, I've heard nothing else. European politicians walk around and complain about the Naira, and I said, what? I mean, this is an extension of a 20 years PTC solution in the US that was forming the build-out of renewable. It has nothing to do with competitive disadvantages Europe. This is about securing permanent, renewable and green energy in the US that will make hydrogen works as well. So if it's that good idea, my incentive here is stop moaning and do something similar in EU instead.
Well, this is hopefully,
now I am going.
We're in a
positive
cycle of competition. Jakob, if I could come to you to talk about an issue that hasn't come up yet, but is very important, and of course Rio Tinto will have some really good insights into this, and that is the issue of critical minerals. So we think about electrification, about wind turbines, about electric vehicles. They all need massive amounts of critical minerals, different forms, different types of critical minerals. And again, if we look at the numbers and we see the assessments we're talking about, depending on what critical mineral, if we're talking about lithium, we need to increase global production of lithium by 41 times that it is today to reach the 2050 goal. Other critical minerals, maybe not 41 times, but maybe 6 times, maybe 8 times. And of course, there are also concerns. I'm a foreign policy person initially, and at heart, there are concerns about those supply chains being dominated, particularly by China, in terms of not just production, but refining and processing. Could you give us, your take on how serious a challenge this is, and what's the best way to address the concentration of supply chains for clean power?
Yeah, no, look, there's no doubt that addressing climate change is basically about building a new energy system for the world, and that's a massive physical task, and it will require a lot of materials. And then the next thing you have to ask yourself, is that a global challenge or is it a regional challenge? And that depends on the degree to which there's geopolitical tension. I think one of the things that we have not been really good at in the West is that Western companies in general just basically don't work too much on their supply chain and basically saying, I just buy things on the market. Whereas my experience, and half of our business is into China, is that China have always been very focused on building supply chain security. And I think that's what the West has started doing now. Because it's a wonderful thing to rely on the market until the market is suddenly not there. And we have had a few disruptions here during COVID, etc., and with the recent war. So I do think just more focus on supply chain security is heightening alert to that. Is there enough? Absolutely. But it's not trivial. And one thing that there's a lot of misunderstandings. It's not that people, for example, saying all rare earths are in China. That's absolutely not true. The point is, it really comes down to processing. And a lot of Western countries have basically abolished all their processing and manufacturing over a couple of decades in the names of globalization. And that's, of course, a political choice in different countries. But there's, geologically, it can be met. It just needs action.
Yeah.
And by the way, the volume that was used 10 years ago is not the volume that is used per output unit today. So the technology also helps you to become much more efficient in using exactly some of the rare things.
Sure, and there are technologies constantly looking at innovating to be able to recycle and that type of thing. Anders, do you want to jump in here? Then I want to turn to Vivianne, give her a chance to talk about electricity market reform.
Yes, what I want to talk about here is, look, we all have to be sort of even competitors, frenemies in this, because the channel is global. And we also have to partner with mining companies, partner with OEMs, because we bring different skills. But the scale of what is needed, I'll give you a case. We just announced the first mega-scale green hydrogen project in the US. It's a $4 billion investment in Texas, 1.5 gigawatts. So it's a large project. That can supply 0.1% of the US long-haul trucking. So there's enough business here for everybody. So the point is that the scale that is needed is just enormous. There's a lot of opportunities. If we had been here in 2020, the States would have been seen in a different light. It would have been like, you're not doing anything. Well, now the States got its act together. You have the IR. We're really gearing up. And now it's like, well, wait a second. Now you're becoming too competitive. Look, the scale of this is that Europe, the US, the rest of the world have to work together. And also, again, with developing countries, they have different needs and different situations. So that must be taken into account. But what I think is really the world has to cooperate. Companies have to cooperate more.
Right.
And so if this it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a question of getting a bigger piece of the pie. The pie is, growing at a rate of, 25, 30% a year. That's what's important. And only working together can we get it done. So, hopefully you don't have a sort of Europe-US squabble about, that would be unproductive. It's really, how can we work together to solve this tremendous challenge?
Sure, thank you. Vivianne, if I could turn to you and just ask for you to come in again with a government perspective before opening this up to the audience and hearing from a special guest we have today. We heard about the markets maybe not being fully developed, and the issue of regulation obviously comes up a lot. Could you say a little bit about how you feel government is, poised to create the playing field for this to be a solvable and actionable problem?
Well, first of all, I would like to respond also to the comment you made about being able to sell what it is that we are trying to do. And I think that that should be a joint effort. And I completely agree that sometimes you have to also take some unpopular measures, like placing windmills in the backyards of people is not always the most popular thing to do. And I also said...
Start with politicians, right?
No, but what I always say is, if it would be me personally, I would prefer to put everything on the ocean, then you don't, then it's not in the land itself. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we have enough clean energy to also make sure that the Earth is livable for future generations. So we have to also take accountability for the choices that we make. And it's not fair to just put it on companies, for example. The second thing is that I think that governments are here to make sure that we facilitate and enable companies, people, organizations to roll out certain things. And then you still have a certain basic package that the government does itself. So I think that we should be very facilitating. And what helps is if you, I was talking to another entrepreneur yesterday who was into flying sustainably. And I also said to him, what we should do as politicians is also create the space for our civil servants to feel comfortable enough to also look where we can create some space within, of course, certain rules and regulations that we have. But we have to understand that we are really investing in innovation a lot. Companies are investing, and regulation is something which can take time to adjust. So we have to be smart about it, and we have to see that regulation keeps up with the innovations that are taking place. And when it comes to natural resources that we need for the transition, because of course this is a very important point and a very fair point, I'm really happy with innovation taking place, which may cause us to need fewer resources. We're quite late in thinking about a national or an international resource strategy. We are developing one now in the Netherlands, but I completely agree that some countries like China have thought about it way longer before we have. And this is something where the business community and politicians should also join forces and really think more long-term instead of focusing on the short-term, because the solutions lie in having enough resources as well to produce and meet the goals that we set together.
Great, thank you. We are fortunate enough to have Governor Pritzker here from Illinois, and I'd like to just invite you, maybe if you want to stand up and say a few words. I love that. I'm sure this was music to your ears as well. Andreas said, now that America has gotten its act together. Those are words I haven't heard in a little while, but you've certainly been involved in passing legislation having to do with climate. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the role of government in creating an enabling environment.
Well, I appreciate that. I think I got invited to go stand in the corner because the United States is a little behind Europe. But I am very pleased to be here because, at least in Illinois, we have made significant attempts to vault ahead as a state. And just to give some of you a sense, though we're in the center of the United States, we're also the 5th largest economy among the states in the United States, and would be about 18th or 19th if we were an independent country. And so we are also a diverse and industrial economy. And so it's challenging to make the conversion from, if you look at the entire Midwest, and we have the most advanced climate action that's been taken in the industrial Midwest. And maybe in the nation with the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And I think it's important to just highlight that the name of the act, because it isn't just a question of whether we're going to make the conversion. It's also about some of the things that have been talked about here about are we training our workforce properly? Are we preparing the public for the future? And so when we talk about equitable jobs, that's hugely important. And it was hugely important as a political matter in order to get the act passed. You can imagine that we have a massive manufacturing economy in the state of Illinois, and so there is some concern anyway about a state where we're already producing. We're a net energy exporter in Illinois, but now the question is, what will this mean for our future? But we're fortunate in many ways in Illinois. We have about 52% of our energy production is nuclear. We have the largest nuclear fleet in the United States. So that's a great base anyway as we're moving toward, and we have established that by 2045 we will be carbon free in the production of energy in the state of Illinois. And so, you know, that means some conversion, right? We have coal plants in operation in Illinois, and we've been very careful about how we ramp those down and what jobs are going to be available to the people in those communities, and so on. But I just really am here to highlight the idea that there is an acceleration going on that I think has been brought to us, or the example of which has been brought to us by many of you. And we are very much in need in the United States, and particularly, I would say, in Illinois and the industrial Midwest, for the technologies that you all are offering. Some of you are already doing business in Illinois, and we started out before we passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act with about 7% of our energy being produced by wind and about 0.5% by solar. Not great, but we will be tripling. That was your point that you made at the beginning. We will be tripling that over the next several years. And so there's an awful lot of need for storage in Illinois, and that's something that we really haven't had. And then, of course, the expansion of wind and solar, and we see a lot of it now. I will end only by saying thank you for setting an example on this panel anyway, and showing, I think, what all of us in the United States need to be doing. The IRA, I just want to put in a word for the IRA. It is a tremendous leap forward for us in the United States, and we're taking full advantage. You know, I will say Illinois led before IRA, but we are taking full advantage of IRA and going to transform our economy. So,
thank you, Governor. Appreciate that. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If I could just, I have one in the front, ask you to stand up, and then from the minister as well.
I'm David Kim from Korea. I am the chair of the Daesun Group, which is one of the largest natural gas company in the country. And I was also the chair of the World Energy Council. So while I was the chair, I asked the experts and the stakeholders in renewable energies the questions I have in mind. That is, when we succeed to cover half of the face of the Earth with windmills and photovoltaic panels and batteries, my speculation is another half will be stacked with disposed, the spent windmills and batteries. So there seems to be no recycle plan for what's going on.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if we could just hear from Minister Ida, the second question, and then I'll ask for the responses to make sure we end on time.
I'll be very quick because we're out of time. So Mr. Stausholm said very correctly that there's an increased interest also in the West for supply chain security. That overlaps with an increased interest in supply chain integrity, because companies also want to report on the climate and nature footprint. And I think that's a good thing for climate change. But we also need to be aware that we need to bring the rest of the world on board in this transition, so that we're not locking in developing countries into a fossil economy that the rich countries are leaving behind. So I think it's a major theme here to make sure that those who are producers down the line, even if they're in non-Western countries, really get the message of the need to transition fast in order not only to help the climate transition, but also to make sure that they continue to develop and are not caught in a middle-income trap.
Great, thank you very much. Would someone like to address the recycling question?
Yeah, of course I will. I think
I'll go to you, Henrik, and then to you, but very quickly.
It's too easy to say, and I think I will invite you personally to Denmark, and then you should come and see. We, in the last year, have done 3/4 of our renewable or energy consumption and supply fully from renewable. And you don't have the picture you're there describing. When we then see it, approximately 85% of a turbine is fully recyclable today and is being fully recycled. You will see in the last 12 months that the blades are now being recycled. And don't forget your trajectory of that we are just now start repowering things that got up on the ground 20 to 30 years ago. So I promise you, your sort of prediction of that's not going to hold.
Great, thank you. Jakob.
So look, the way we look at it, I mean, circularity is critical, but it will just take a little longer. The problem is to get circularity of certain things. Certain things, steel, you're getting up there, but it's quite different in different places. I think the best place to go and look is probably Singapore, but there are other places on Earth where circularity is not coming in. One of the very disappointing things is it's still very difficult technology-wise to reuse the lithium. Yeah. And we have a very small thing. And the thing you have to think about right now is, first you need to increase the world stock of a product, say for example lithium. You need 10 times more lithium in 2030 than in 2020. And then you cannot recycle it unless you have a stock of it. So you should think about this decade as we really need to get on with the climate change, and we really need to get on with building the new energy system. And I think in more material terms, the circularity will kick in a little later. It's probably more for the next decade. Not that we shouldn't do everything we can right now. It just physically will take longer.
And apologies, Andreas, we're out of time. I want to yield the last 30 seconds to Kristen from the WEF.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. This has been a really interesting discussion. And I think what is clear is if we really want to collectively decarbonize the economy, there's two sides to this. First of all, we need to expand and to decarbonize clean power capacity. And at the same time, we need to be looking at the demand side transformation that needs to happen. And we are, we titled this session Electric Decade because there is so much that needs to be done in the short term. And Meghan said these numbers at the beginning, and I'm going to repeat them because I think they're really important, that clean power needs to triple by 2030, and then it needs to expand 9 times by 2050. And that on the demand side, we're at 20% electricity demand is electricity, and that needs to jump to 50% by 2050. So the challenge is really enormous. And as a response to this, the World Economic Forum is launching today a Clean Power Accelerator and a Electrification Accelerator to look at the demand side transformation that needs to take place. So we are really excited about this. We welcome everybody's participation in this. And I just want to thank our panelists and thank the governor for all of your insights and solutions, which we want to incorporate into these new programs. And Meghan, thank you so much for an amazing job moderating. I'll leave it to you to close out.
Well, thank you, Kristen. Let me simply thank everyone for coming, thank our panelists for all their perspectives and for their commitment to solving these challenges and getting us to where we need to go. Have a great day.
Thank you.